Divine Divinity is an isometric action RPG released in 2002, developed by Larian Studios, and published by CDV Software Entertainment. For some, its relevance today is solely tied to its status as a precursor to Larian's newer titles, but the original, first Divinity game is still a fun and addictive fantasy RPG, despite some flaws, and it generated some excitement and praise back when it came out, receiving nominations for Best RPG of the Year awards by several gaming media outlets, although ultimately losing out to RPGs by then bigger, more established developers like Bethesda and BioWare. It's definitely a game that wears its inspirations on its sleeve, but managed to blend various aspects from them in a way so that the end result is something unique, combining the addicting combat and random loot drops of Diablo with classic CRPG questing, a massive open world to explore, and its own extensive skill system. Its story is filled with fantasy cliches, but the writing is detailed and contains a nice dose of humor, which doesn't always come off as parody, but still makes it less typical in some regards.
You insolent dog! I should... What was that? Garth, protect me!
Unfortunately, Divine Divinity also has some bugs and very noticeable balancing issues, but no aspect of the game was more universally disliked by fans and critics than its title. Before its release, there was a different working title, Divinity: The Sword of Lies, which I think anybody and everybody would agree sounds much better. Everybody except for the publisher's CEO, that is, who, according to a forum post by a Larian staff member, thought that the title should contain an alliteration thanks to the recent success of Sudden Strike. Sudden Strike has a nice ring to it, Divine Divinity not so much. It's like calling your game Sudden Suddenly or Baldur's Baldy. Those who weren't scared off by the weird title and actually bought the game were greeted by this character selection screen. The customization options here are very slim, but increase drastically once you actually start playing. For now though, you choose between a male and female version of 3 basic classes: Warrior, Mage, or Survivor, which is the game's version of a rogue or thief or, bad person.
I'm a bad boy.
The most impactful outcome of your decision here is the rate at which increasing stats by leveling affects damage, accuracy, defense, hit points, and mana. A warrior with a strength at say 50 gets a damage bonus 4 times larger than a mage with that same level of strength. Likewise, a mage gains mana at twice the rate of a warrior by raising intelligence. I found exact multipliers in guides online and didn't see them actually stated anywhere in-game, but it's all intuitive enough that players should have a pretty good idea of what they're getting into. And even if you did make the mistake of thinking a warrior could gain mana like a mage, equipment can raise stats too, and your possibilities definitely aren't limited by what you choose at the beginning. That's mostly because of the skill system. The skill menu is organized based on class, but any class has the freedom to spend skill points gained by leveling on any skill. So if you wanted a battle mage, you could pick the warrior class and raise some melee skills, but specialize in magic too, while wearing equipment that increases mana. Or maybe you want to play as a survivor who likes to creep around and rely on magic to summon monsters to do your dirty work. Or maybe you don't know what you want to play as and just want to try certain skills out as you go, which is likely to be the case to at least some degree for a first-time playthrough, because there are some very interesting skills to tinker with, and a lot of them to choose from. Divine Divinity isn't a party-based RPG, you control just a single character. But if you're feeling lonely, the Aura of Command skill turns summoned creatures or resurrected enemies into permanent bodyguards, who follow you everywhere and have no problem fighting to the death for you. Okay, they're basically slaves, but bodyguard sounds better. The Necro Shift skill temporarily turns you into an enemy that you've killed, so you can stroll right by other enemies without attracting notice, which works great to avoid trouble unless you accidentally wander into a town. Or maybe you want to invest in alchemy and polymorph to become a mad scientist who hunts for mushrooms to make potions with, while turning enemies that cross your path into frogs. The freedom to shape your character as you go and not be locked tightly to a specific role from the beginning is one of the most enjoyable aspects of the progression system. But unfortunately, it's undercut to an extent by the fact that some skills are much more useful than others, sometimes too useful, and there are limited skill points available with no respec option, so experimentation does carry the risk of wasting points that could have been used for something better. but I'll talk about that a bit more later in the video. There are 3 cinematic cutscenes in the game, one at the very beginning, one right before reaching the late game areas, and one after beating the game. The final one is mostly concerned with wrapping up the story, but the other 2 are stylish, dramatic, and pretty impressive if you take into account their age, especially the middle one. The intro cinematic shows your hero as a male warrior being attacked by orcs, while elsewhere mysterious shadowy figures attempt to slay a divine being. After thwarting their attempt, the divine being splits herself into 3, escapes in dramatic fashion, and then marks the hero with Divinity just in time to save him from an orc attacker about to land a mortal blow. A white cat wanders out of the woods, and its affection, along with peaceful music and a town revealed to be nearby, effectively create a moment of serenity, indicating that you're safe for now. The town is called Aleroth, and it's basically a tutorial area. It's rural and cozy with tranquil background music and is a nice rendition of a traditional Shire-like starting town, but with a sinister twist lurking beneath it all. Before that reveals itself, you get to explore for a bit, complete a couple of side quests, and have a few pleasant interactions with the locals.
Oh no, my poor wee little piggy! Why? Why did you do it?
Eventually, an early game quest to find out why the town's leader has recently gone insane leads you to catacombs beneath the town, which have 5 huge levels packed with hordes of angry skeletons. It's pretty strange encountering one of the biggest and toughest dungeons in the entire game right at the very beginning, and the early game pacing does suffer as a result. If you've checked your map, then you know that there's a massive world out there beyond the town waiting for you to explore, but it takes hours to get through this part. You can technically skip it and just waltz right out the town's front gate, but dealing with the droves of hostile orcs surrounding the town is a really tough task without leveling up in the catacombs first. Just ask these guys. I did still manage to enjoy this part though, and whether or not you feel the same way largely comes down to how much you like killing things in this game. I admit I'm kind of a sucker for this Diablo-style combat. The addicting clickfest, impactful sound effects, and periodic excursions back to town to trade for items and gear were enough to keep me going. Plus, this statue of a woman gives you a little zombie bodyguard who helps make the slog more tolerable. See, he's not a slave, I'm setting him free.
Finally.
Oh. Things definitely do get better and the game really opens up once you finally leave Aleroth though. The amount of combat never scales back, there's still tons of that, but other elements like exploration, narrative, and questing come to the forefront too, and make the game feel more like a complete RPG. Even though I found the catacombs tolerable, I wasn't shocked to see some people say that they quit before completing it, because after being down here for so long, they just assumed that the rest of the game was more the same. What this early dungeon does ensure though is that you're not a puny weakling when you finally leave Aleroth. Aleroth's residents are healers and they helped you out when you were hurt, so now you've returned the favor by helping their leader. You're no longer just a random nobody and now have some status within the world, however small. That world is Rivellon, the fantasy realm where the entire Divinity series takes place, and uncovering its distinct areas, secrets, subplots, weird Easter eggs, and clearing out its abundance of monsters are much more of a driving force than the main questline for most of the game. The sense of discovery is quite good, with many of the places you find offering something worthwhile to engage with. Since you're a bit stronger after leaving Aleroth, much of this massive world becomes accessible to you right then. And even if you tried to just go do the main quest, its objectives are so spaced out that you're basically guaranteed to get swept up by the world's many distractions on your way to them. The amount of side quests and random excursions to grind enemies or just explore became so numerous that I even forgot what the main quest was at one point, and had to scroll way down my quest log to figure it out. Specific areas have distinct themes, which makes the world feel varied and diverse, with places like farmlands, soldier encampments, dense cities, markets, an elven village, and dwarven halls. In case you haven't been able to tell already, the pixel art is really well done, and the 2D visuals have aged better than some of Divine Divinity's contemporaries who had just made the switch to 3D graphics. Yes, I'm talking about you, Neverwinter Nights. The model animations are smooth, and while there are some places where you can tell extra effort was put in, overall the world consistently looks quite good for a game from this era. Small nature details like animated birds and frogs work in sync with realistic ambience to help bring outdoor areas to life, and these reflective puddles and pools still kind of blow my mind every time I go past them. Best of all to me were the interiors though, especially some of the more dense ones. Every fantasy RPG is required by law to have at least a couple of taverns, and the rich and lively ones in Divine Divinity are some of my favorites. And even they're outdone by some of the bigger mansions and castles. In addition to the fine detail and lighting in buildings, there are also no loading screens when you enter them, and most of them contain lots of objects that you can interact with. Sometimes you need to throw random objects out of the way to reveal a hidden door or pathway, but a lot of the items you can pick up serve no real purpose gameplay-wise, and are really just there to add an extra layer of detail and immersion. It's a dream come true for kleptomaniacs, and opens up possibilities for things like hoarding weird stuff and housing. I don't know what it was about RPGs from 2002 wanting you to move into a recently murdered person's home, but you can do that here too in the starting town, or buy one or take over one, and decorate it with random fancy things you find during your travels. Divine Divinity is notorious for some of its cheese tactics, which I'll get into more later, but one exploit that's relevant here is that when searching containers or dealing with traders, you can save and keep reloading until the randomly generated loot turns into something that you want. Too much of this takes the fun out of progression and can result in becoming overpowered, but it is convenient in some scenarios, like if you don't want to keep revisiting traders, or when you find fixed and rare special equipment and don't want to feel duped if its stats and enchantments aren't top-notch, so you reload until they are. Managing loot in your inventory or storage containers is a pain because they don't automatically sort or organize contents, other than a few broad categories in your inventory. This was the most consistently annoying thing throughout the game for me. Everything essentially turns into a cluttered mess unless you keep dragging items around to try and keep things organized. It did get a little easier once I put more storage containers in my house to help keep things separated, but the extra effort still felt unnecessary. Exploring the map can be a little tedious sometimes too, because you need to remove fog of war everywhere you go. However, I also found this strangely addictive and kinda satisfying. This definitely had something to do with the quality of the artwork because it felt sort of like dusting off an old painting to reveal what's beneath. I was determined to uncover every square inch that I could, and I actually got frustrated in one zone because certain spots in the middle were inaccessible and were just like black holes sinking into the abyss through space and time towards an endless void. The game world also has a day and night cycle, but oddly no NPCs seem to care one single bit. I don't know what kind of potions they're drinking, but whatever it is, it makes them so wired that they never sleep. They still won't let you use their beds to recover though, but that's okay because there's a cool little tactic where combining two bunches of straw creates a little hay bed, or you could teleport right back to your house and sleep in your own comfy bed. There are waypoints around the world which, after some work to get them activated, conveniently let you teleport to major locations. But the other more interesting and novel way to teleport is these two portable pyramid stones you get near the beginning of the game. Place one on the ground wherever you want, and then use the other to teleport to your chosen location. It's a really useful feature that I relied on heavily, mainly by keeping one in my house, which let me zip right back there to sleep and recover or access storage whenever I needed to. Divine Divinity's soundtrack is for sure one of the game's high points. The choice of instruments perfectly gels with the high fantasy setting, with vocals for some tracks that add a kind of elegant, celestial quality. There's also a solid variety of tracks, which effectively set or enhance the mood in specific areas, like the chilling, ambient tracks in dungeons, grand and epic tracks while out adventuring, cheerful, upbeat music in taverns, and probably my favorite, some of the slower and slightly melancholy tracks while traveling through towns or more peaceful areas. Just describing the music makes it sound like what you'd typically expect from a fantasy RPG, because for the most part, it is. But it's also well done that it still manages to sound distinct, and it's definitely one of the more memorable and enjoyable aspects of the game. Story elements in Divine Divinity are still a major focus even when ignoring the main quest, because there are tons of NPCs out there inhabiting the world, and if they don't offer a side quest, which many of them do, then they at least have some dialogue which can get pretty extensive. Some copy and pasted NPCs repeat the same lines as each other, but there are plenty of unique ones too. Plus, both the generic and some of the unique NPCs help the world feel alive and your actions more meaningful by changing what they say to react to things that you've done, like completing important quests. Hunting down and discovering all the quest-related subplots was my favorite part of exploring, but the freedom you have here is undercut by the fact that you can fail or break quite a few quests depending on when you do them or certain choices you make. This can definitely be annoying, but it didn't create any huge problems for me, because there are so many quests that even if you mess up a few, it's usually not the end of the world. I think I only messed up like 2 and had to reload a few times to avoid messing up a couple more. I also didn't run into any issues with the main quest. Regardless, this is definitely a game where it's a good idea to save a lot using multiple files. And if you're intent on 100% completion, then using a guide to avoid these scenarios will save you some headaches. The quality and complexity of quests varies, but most of them felt worthwhile. Some are very straightforward, but others allow non-linear solutions or have moral dilemmas, and some have multiple paths leading to different outcomes. For example, there's one where you encounter a vampire about to feed on an innocent boy, and you have the option to offer your blood instead, which will save the boy but results in you permanently losing stat points. Another very random-seeming quest even has a consequence so severe that it'll wipe out the entire population of one of the maps. Sometimes the world seems totally uninterested and unmoved by your actions though. One instance that really bugged me was when a few major villains popped up in a big army camp and possessed the friendly soldiers there, who then became not friendly. I had to butcher all like 50 of them to survive, which should have been pretty unpleasant news for their captain staying just next door. But he didn't seem to care or know or have anything to say about it at all. He does like to randomly insult and threaten you though, which at least made me feel a bit better about slaughtering his men. Probably the most noticeable thing about the game's main plot and world building is that, on the surface at least, they're very derivative. Mountain-dwelling dwarves in conflict with elves living deep in the forest, humans in a wide-scale conflict with orcs. A wise old wizard mentors your player character, who of course is the Chosen One, technically called the Marked One here. It's definitely not something like Planescape Torment, but if you're fine with some really tropey fantasy, the writing is fleshed out enough to give the world depth and create a slowly developing plot that hits some of the traditional epic fantasy story beats. I haven't played all of the other Divinity games. The first Original Sin is the only one I've played all the way through, but that was still enough for me to notice some lore and characters who had their origins here. And the canon protagonist from Divine Divinity, Lucian, continues to play a big role later in the series. The humor is where the writing's originality comes from, and for me, it was the most memorable aspect of the story. It isn't present everywhere you go, so while the overall tone is a bit lighthearted and whimsical, the story still manages to have a serious side too. It's more subtle than something like Fable, yet still clearly a focal point of the writing, and there's a fair bit more personality here than in most fantasy RPGs. There are a bunch of examples I could choose from, but one of my favorites is the boy Duke Janus. Much of the first half of the game consists of trying to achieve an audience with him, and then when you finally do, you find out that he's a complete brat who decides to enslave you as his protector for the next 40 years. Then he sends you off on some goofy quests to find toys and gifts for his mean little girlfriend. They both berate you with insults the entire time, and you get to clap back a few times in hilarious fashion. The voice acting that's present for certain characters is mostly hit or miss, with some sounding pretty good and others sounding pretty terrible. The quality matters less for some of the sillier dialogue, since, it's not supposed to be taken seriously anyway.
You! Do you know what just happened? My dear precious Layla came weeping to me to tell me that you had called her a spoiled brat.
Mordanius, my friend. Did you drink the herbal tea I prepared for you? Oh, look! Here they come! Oh, begone, foul creatures!
Mix, is dark mistresses.
We like Big Dragon, yes, Flix!
Flux!
We love very big dragon. But Doc Mistresses hate, understand? Please?
What? That bastard son of a halfling! I'll cut his philandering pecker off!
That wasn't necessary, Jocast. Don't fling rocks from inside your own glass-walled house.
There are a few bosses and special enemies in the game, but the huge majority of Divine Divinity's combat is against packs of standard enemies. Orcs, trolls, thugs, lizardmen, snakes, and even bees, which is a little strange. Can you imagine trying to kill a bee with a sword or a bow? There's even one part of the game where you get involved in a war between bees and wasps, which was almost as funny as it was weird. Anyway, combat takes up as much of the game as anything else, probably more. There's a finite amount of enemies, but so many of them that you'll almost certainly be glad that they don't respawn. I know I was. Fights are usually fast-paced and can definitely get pretty intense when the enemy count gets high. You do have the ability to pause and issue commands for a more tactical approach, but I rarely found myself doing so because with how much combat there is, it was more fun to try and pound through encounters quickly. And the mechanics cater to this too. An auto-target key lets you attack and zip towards the closest enemy, hotkeys let you instantly cycle between skills and recovery items, and you only have to click your mouse once to continuously attack. The controls felt pretty smooth and natural with these features working together, and the punchy sound effects and cool visual effects for some of the skills made fights more enjoyable too. But it didn't take long for me to start running into some issues. Not long after I left the starting town, a random drop gave me a sword enchanted with frost damage. And my god was this thing impressive. It didn't just dish out extra damage, it also completely froze enemies for a few seconds. Which is awesome, right? Now I could go and deal with these annoying orc drummers who like to heal before you can kill them. But I could also easily deal with pretty much everything else I started running into. The problem was that the sword ignores enemy resistances, and it can freeze even the toughest enemies like bosses, which makes a lot of fights way more trivial than they should be. The frost skill has the same freezing effect, but can be resisted, and you have to actually work to raise the skill in order to cast it on more powerful enemies. The sword was so incredibly overpowered that I had to ditch it in order to not ruin progression and feel like I was cheesing my way through the game. Likewise, there's a skill that lets you use mechanical scorpion traps, which attack enemies. These little guys are so strong and work so well as a distraction that they're basically a cheat code. You can even use a whole bunch of them at once, and they're pretty easy to collect. Plus, you can make them even stronger by leveling up their governing skill, even though they already start out really powerful. So I had to refrain from using this too much too, although I did still hold on to them and threw one or two down on occasions when I found myself in a jam. It is kind of fun to watch them scutter around and go to work, but using them too much just makes the game way too easy. On the opposite side of things, some skills aren't that great. And while most of them aren't totally useless, there are sometimes better alternatives. However, there's nothing in-game that indicates this, so you're just left to figure it out through some frustrating trial and error. Or be like me and dig through some old Larian forum posts, which help point me in the right direction. I think you'd have to actually try to waste skill points for things to get so bad that you'd actually paint yourself into a corner, and even then I suppose you could rely on exploits, but a much more balanced system still would have been preferable. The good news though is that when you find a useful but not overpowered skill, you can rely on it really heavily, and you don't need a ton of skills max to finish the game. I focused mainly on passive damage and defensive skills, and then maxed out Hell Spikes, which does some nice AoE damage. Since I was a warrior without much intelligence, the high mana cost meant that I needed gear to boost my mana pool. And to do this, I invested a few points in an enchanting skill so I could add stat boosting charms to my gear, which I had to find or pay for. I ended up being pretty powerful, but the work involved to get there made the progression feel rewarding. But despite my best efforts not to use exploits, the game actually tricked me into using a pretty big one anyway. Towards the end of the game, you leave the main area and wind up in a place called the Wastelands, which is very true to its name. There's a big map to uncover, but hardly anything to do besides kill enemies. What a waste. I was pretty strong at this point, but it still seemed weird that the enemies could hardly damage me at all, even if I just stood around doing absolutely nothing. Come on, please hurt me. I checked my stats and noticed that my resistances had somehow gone up to almost 300, despite having gear and skills that should have maybe had them around 100. After some investigation, I learned that this was because of a rare bug where equipment enchanted to raise a certain skill can make your resistances gradually just keep growing over time, indefinitely. There's apparently another version of this bug which can make your resistances go down instead, which sounds way worse. It's like the game knew I was trying to avoid exploits and just decided, haha, no, too bad. So at first, I was pretty annoyed by this, but then I decided this could be a good opportunity for something else. You see, the two endgame areas, the wastelands and the final dungeon, are the weakest parts of the game, because everything turns into a long, repetitive combat slog. Or, thanks to some special new skills you gain access to, you could just transform into a ghost and skip almost the entire thing, neither of which are very enjoyable options at this stage of the game. Since the game was already forcing me to cheat, I decided to try and make this part more fun, or at least more amusing, by using all of the scorpion traps I'd saved up over the course of the game, which was a lot. First, I used the Aura of Command skill to turn a few of them into personal bodyguards, whom I could heal and even cast defensive spells on. Then I just walked around letting them murder everything in my path like I was some kind of crazy scorpion tamer. And each time I ran into a tough monster or one of the 5 endgame bosses, I just started spamming all of the other scorpions I had to completely overwhelm them, which did actually look kind of hilarious. This didn't save the ending areas from feeling lackluster, but still made them a bit more entertaining than my other options could've. Even with all its balancing issues, bugs, and other flaws, Divine Divinity's ambitious design, classic CRPG charm, and the freedom it grants to players makes it a worthwhile RPG that I'm glad I got the chance to dive into. It's a bit too rough around the edges to stand toe-to-toe with some of the big-name CRPG classics, but I don't think it's so drastically far off from those games that it should be passed over quite as much as it is. Despite Larian's surge in popularity over the last decade or so, I don't think Divine Divinity has really seen a significant bump in popularity or interest. I'm sure that isn't helped by its age, and the fact that it takes some tweaks to get it running well on modern hardware. I used DG Voodoo to help things run smoothly and avoid crashes, and kept the resolution down to avoid scaling issues. The chances of it getting some kind of remake or remaster seem very slim. Larian appears to be all in on their new Divinity title, and the original Sin games are much more common and accessible starting point for people getting into the franchise these days. I still can't help but wonder what a remaster for Divine Divinity might look like, since it's a game that would really benefit from some extra polish and fixes. Oh, and a better title. Just don't touch the music.